Hello there, so we've established that the ranking process and its history is complex. This video briefly overviews the evolution of qualified maps and touches on the various events which influenced its change. Covering years worth of mapping history in 13 minutes though means a lot of content had to be left out, like essentially all the background behind those events. So today, let's slow down and investigate this part of the timeline. February 2015, when I claimed to beat Map Nominator, went rogue and qualified 6 maps in under 10 minutes. Intentionally not checking them for issues. We know what this might have contributed towards, the limiting of 1 qualification per user per day. But what exactly led up to this point? What caused this beat Map Nominator to act so out of line and abuse his qualification privileges? And why do so when the only conclusion is obvious punishment? To answer that, let's look at what it meant to be a beat Map Nominator from the perspective of one mapper and modder, cdfa. cdfa is a guy whose history predates any of my time on Osu. His mapping style developed between 2010 and 2012, after which he appeared to lose relevancy as everyone progressed around him. His maps became outdated, and his mods were a relic of previous quality standards. For most, that would be enough reason to leave the game, but not for him. He gave off the impression of having one main goal, becoming someone important on Osu, and helping the mapping community from a respectful position within it. Based on the countless posts he's made attempting to handle mapping controversy in one way or another, I think he definitely cared about the betterment of the mapping and modding system, but his voice was never taken seriously. He maintained a casual yet brash attitude at nearly all times, and when expressing any discontent, he appeared to be just another angry fish in the salty sea of mappers. Anything he tried was met with failure every time. Despite the apparent hopelessness of these efforts, his dreams actually began to look not too far off once the BAT split took place in August 2014. BAT, or BAT, stood for Beat Map Appreciation Team, which was the name for the group of modders in charge of promoting maps to the ranked category since 2008. This was the peak status an active modder could achieve, a role of admiration by mappers associated with competence in the field, which was mainly marked by moderation powers, a red name, and a forum title. If cdfa could join the ranks of the BAT, he would easily be well respected, and therefore could have the opportunity to make changes he so often proposed. Well, that's what he believed at least, and that's what motivated him to unsuccessfully apply as a BAT for years, until the previously mentioned split. The split of the BAT into the BAT and the QAT was the biggest change the ranking process has ever seen. Its purpose was to transition towards an automated system of letting community members control what maps were pushed towards rank, rather than letting a small batch of hand-picked elites handle everything. That being said, the BAT needed to become more accessible for the average user in order to accurately represent community member decisions, and the first step in doing this was separating it from Osu's volunteer staff. Forum and chat moderation, both of which could lead to trouble in the wrong hands, were no longer part of the BAT's privileges, meaning the screening process for becoming a BAT was nowhere near as strict as it was in the past, and thus, more people could join. The role of a BAT after the split was only to nominate beat maps for rank, while moderation of the mapping community and its creations was more so left in the hands of the newly formed QAT. So, considering requirements for joining the BAT were now loosened, it should be no surprise that cdfa made his way onto the team immediately after the changes were put in place. He earned himself a fancy red name, the Beat Map Appreciation Team title right underneath it, and the ability to nominate maps. A pretty good step forward for him, though I'm not too sure he was entirely satisfied with his new position since it didn't grant him the respect he initially expected. Time revealed that the new BAT just wasn't as special as the old BAT. The first waves of new members more than doubled the size of the group, so each individual was given less of a voice in the crowd. Plus, the BAT was no longer the highest position to reach as a modder. The QAT had more privileges in the mapping community and more of a say in how it could be governed, so it was therefore the new position cdfa set his eyes on. At the very least, being a BAT was a good indication that he was on the right path towards his goal, since BATs did have more privileges than the average user. Aside from their nomination ability and fancy name indicators, BATs at the time helped choose who else in the community could join the BAT. This was initially handled through private means, but later publicized in the BAT-specific subforum called Beat Map Management. In here was a thread where BATs could elect and vote for whichever modders they believed were skilled enough to nominate maps. And just given that premise, you should be skeptical. Votes were only the first step in the promotion process, a filter of sorts. though it may not have worked too well. If a user received votes from a lot of bats, there was ideally a good chance they knew a fair bit about modding. More likely though, they just had a lot of bat friends. Regardless, every month, nominees with 15 or more votes had their modding history checked to determine whether or not they were active enough to join the bat. By inputting the variables of a modder's total kudos and mods from the previous 3 months into these formulas, a single number would be returned. The details of the formulas are confusing and not too important, but ultimately their purpose was to value consistency. For example, if someone modded 100 maps in 1 month but 0 maps in the other 2 months, they would have a lower score than someone who modded 10 maps each month. So, if that total number was above a rumored 1200 threshold, a modder could join the Beatmap Appreciation team. That's how I joined in November 2014. I received 20 votes from various bats, and my modding score barely surpassed the cutoff, so I was added as part of the team. By this point, 3 months after the split, cdfa had gained a reputation for himself among other bats. His lower standard of judging map quality was making itself apparent, and some people took action against that. I decided my first operations as a bat would be revoking nominations from cdfa, since I believed the maps he nominated had large-scale problems. Yeah, I'm a dick, but the worst part was that I wasn't alone. Other bats agreed that cdfa's nominations weren't up to par, and so he didn't have full respect from his peers. Combining that with his attitude, any of his propositions of change for the nomination system were met with negativity, both from bats and other higher-ups, despite how beneficial they possibly could have been. Given his goal of becoming an impactful figure in the mapping community, his poor reputation stood in the way. Still though, he stuck through it and proved himself to be someone of value when Beatmap nomination ranking went into effect at that time. This was a system of even more complex formulas used to calculate how effectively a bat could perform their job of nominating maps. It started with a bat's initial score calculated via kudos and 3 months worth of mods, then added values based on the next month's total mods, nominations, and bubble pops, and finally subtracted values based on how many of their nominations were disqualified and how serious the issues were. A lot of confusing formulas and variables, I know. It's what was necessary for the type of automated system planned at the time. With all these numbers calculated, each bat would receive a monthly score listed on a public spreadsheet, along with their total score consisting of their initial and monthly ones. Then, if a bat's total score fell into the negatives due to either inactivity or poor nomination choices for 2 months in a row, they would be removed from the team for at least 3 months. Honestly, I liked this system. It did apparently have more faults than strengths, which are worth discussing in detail some other time, but I found it fun to compare scores between my fellow bats. It was a nice incentive to mod, knowing I could get a high monthly and total score if I performed well. At the same time though, it was stressful for most people having to think about how a single disqualification could affect their score for the month, and whether or not they would be kicked from the team for doing too much incorrectly. But regardless, I think it wouldn't be too far off to say that cdfa was also one of the few people who appreciated bat scores. While nobody gave him credit for his work, his ranking as a bat showed that he might have actually been doing something right. A decent amount of his nominations may have gotten disqualified, but he made up for that with the sheer amount of nominations he did. For multiple months in a row, his monthly scores placed him in the top 5 out of over 100 bats, and his total score was higher than nearly everyone's by the time January came. Theoretically, this should have earned cdfa the admiration he always wanted. According to the numbers, he was one of the most effectively working members on the team, and by far the most active. Yet still, few actually respected him. His wasted efforts trying to prove himself as a worthy member of the modding community, paired with the changes that came at the end of January, were what caused his spirits to finally break. The appeal of being a bat for cdfa was being able to make an impact on the mapping and modding community. However, the bat after the split wasn't what he expected, and so he worked hard to become the best bat he could in hopes of receiving notice and rising to the QAT. The likelihood of that, though, took a nosedive when the few extra privileges of the bat were removed all at once. On January 31st, 2015, an announcement was posted to the Beatmap Management subforum. It explained the state of the current bat situation and what changes needed to be made to more accurately reflect the future's automated system. This began with the conclusion of bat elections and voting. Any active modder could apply to join on their own without having connections to at least 15 pre-existing bats, meaning there was no more favoritism in the group. A fair change in most people's eyes, despite limiting the rights of bats. What didn't go over too well was a change to the group's name. The acronym BAT was still associated with its past role of staff member and moderator, which was completely misleading in its current usage. Bats at this time were average users with nomination abilities, which meant the team part of the name was removed. Beatmap Appreciator was the new name for BAT members, which was adjusted shortly after to Beatmap Nominator because, well, Beatmap Appreciator sounds silly. The change that angered most people, though, was the removal of what made a BAT, or BA I suppose, actually a special member of the community: the red name. It made a user stand out in the forums and their user page, signifying their modding abilities. But given the shift towards a fully automated community-run system, making users seem overly special was counterproductive. Names were returned to their original black, and nobody was satisfied. All these changes were only negatives for everyone in the group, and the one member who took it most seriously was cdfa. His reason for being part of the group was to make an impact on the mapping and modding community, and his means of doing so was through respectable authority. With these new changes though, he was being reduced back to the role of an average modder without any influence. If he knew about the removal of user page titles to come a few weeks later for bats or Beatmap Appreciators or Beatmap Nominators, whatever they were called, I can only imagine he would be even more outraged. With his motivation gone, he decided it was time to leave. He had next to no chance of controlling anything in the community, and so he felt there was no longer a point. cdfa sent messages of resignation from his newly minimized role to those in charge, but in the end, he didn't even have control of himself. Because the Beatmap nomination system was designed to be automated, he couldn't just quit. He needed to be inactive for multiple months in a row, resulting in at least 2 months worth of negative scores. Then he would finally be kicked from the group. He thought this was ridiculous. For months, he had worked making essentially no headway in his goal of becoming someone who mattered. He wanted love, affection, adoration. Everyone thought he was unworthy of it. That was a crime that could never be forgiven. The entire Beatmap nomination system had trapped and consumed him, so there was only one way out. On February 4th, cdfa pulled the trigger on 6 maps in under 10 minutes, then on himself. By abusing the last of his power, he finally had control, and was able to manually remove himself from the Beatmap nomination group. And regrettably for him, that also ended his slim chances of making any major difference in the community from then onwards. This was essentially the end of cdfa and the Beatmap appreciation team. From his perspective, that is. Everything here has been clearly over-dramatized to match cdfa's view on the ranking process and how perception played a role in it. The bat really ended the day the split occurred in August 2014, but that only took visible effect at the start of February 2015. The ranking process changed a fair bit during this time, but what changed more so was the average user's perception of it. For modders, the start of the bat split was a peak. It gave anyone a chance, even someone who had been rejected over and over again. The loss of all extra bat privileges, however, was the all-time low. It made BNs feel as they were intended to feel from the beginning, just like ordinary community members in an automated system. And for cdfa, that perception of the bat was enough reason to act out of line. Anyway, changes to the ranking process from here onwards are worth discussing as well, along with other areas to focus on within this short 6-month period, but I'll leave those for another time. Thanks to these guys for supporting this video, and I'll see you next week.